My name is Jessica Curtis. I am with the Westerville Public Library Adult Reference Services. Thank you all for coming today to join us for Sleeping Beauties, Landscaping with Spring Ephemerals with Gale Martin, who is the owner of Natives in Harmony Nursery. And Gale, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Well, I'm really excited to be able to do this, and this is one of the first ones I've done from home. I'm really excited to be able to present this, in the era of COVID. It's kind of nice to still be able to feel like you can reach out and communicate with folks. And I've spent my whole day in the greenhouse today working on potting up Sleeping Beauties, those spring ephemerals. So it's kind of nice to be able to talk about them tonight and acquaint you with some of the wonderful plants that I've been playing with for the last week, getting them into pots. And I guess before I get too far into talking about the nursery, let's just get started with this video. So what is a spring ephemeral? A spring ephemeral generally means that it's short-lived or it lasts for a brief time. There are a lot of spring blooming woodland plants that are ephemeral, but the ephemerals are the ones that just appear as the weather is warming and then they disappear when summer arrives. So a spring flowering ephemeral doesn't really die, it just goes dormant. So it goes back to sleep. It wakes up, it does its thing, and then it goes back to sleep. Most spring ephemerals take advantage of that month or two in late winter when the sun, the water, and the warmth are available and the soil is starting to warm up on the woodland floor. They take advantage of the fact that they can get sun because the trees and shrubs haven't leafed out yet, and cast shade onto the floor where the flowers are going to have trouble getting the sun. So these are perennials and they really go fast. Like, it's amazing how fast they can start going. So they're triggered by the fact that the soil starts to warm and they send up their foliage, their blossom, they set seed, and sometimes will completely do all of this in 8 weeks. So it's kind of amazing when you think about how fast they come up and they bloom and then they go back to sleep. Once the leaves of the taller plants then are blocking the light and the water from the ephemerals, they just go dormant and they'll reserve the nutrients that they gathered in that 6 to 8 weeks and then wait until next year when it's time to do the same thing again. I will say that I have seen plants like trilliums who, when they get hit by a cold wind, you can almost see them shiver and they may be leafed out and then they will just shrivel up and go back to sleep. It's like they're saying, oh man, this is too cold for me. Forget it. I'll see you next year. And trilliums will do that. They're one of the worst for just going back to sleep. And then you miss out on that beautiful bloom that year. And of course, here on the top picture, that is Trillium grandiflorum, which is the large white trillium. So late February and into March, oftentimes that's when you start seeing those ephemerals. And the peak of the season is late April through May. And, we all know what a woodland looks like, at least most of us do. And there's nothing more beautiful in my mind than a woodland. Now, this picture here, you're not really seeing the spring ephemerals. What you're seeing are the plants that are going to persist through the summer. And we're not going to talk about these. We're not going to talk about ferns, things like wild geranium. We're not going to discuss. I could really go on, but I think that's a topic for another talk. So our first plant that I wanted to talk about today is skunk cabbage. And people may not really think much about skunk cabbage as a flower, but it's the first spring ephemeral that you see in the woods. Now, it may not be something you want in your garden because it smells like rotten meat. And that's because it's pollinated by flies. So if you're pollinated by flies and you really want them to come in and make sure that your flower gets pollinated, well, you smell like something that flies would like, which obviously is rotten meat. But the foliage from that is absolutely beautiful. And the flowers are interesting too. And they're blooming right now. So if you went into a woodland, you would see the skunk cabbage blooming in those moist places. And then after the flower is done, you'll see the leaves come out. An absolutely beautiful plant, which is also one of the really early spring bloomers, is Sharp-lobed Hepatica. and also the round-lobed Hepatica. So they're really short, 3 to 6 inches tops. You'll see the foliage generally, and the foliage may persist through the season, but I still consider it more of a spring ephemeral. You can get different colors. You may have blue or kind of a lavender and white. In some areas, one color will be predominant, and then in other areas, a different color will be. But this loves dappled sunlight. And when I see this in the woodlot, mostly I see it on a slope. So it likes well-drained soil, and it can do medium to dry. But it's absolutely beautiful when you see a patch of these. And a lot of times you won't have the ground covered with them, but you will have big patches of them scattered throughout. Another great one is the trout lily. And you may see the white or the yellow. They're very, very similar. They like the same habitats. And the interesting thing about these is that they might be, that colony that you find in the woods might be 100 years old. And that's amazing. So when we think about, oh, I want to build my house in the woods, we should always think about things like these trout lilies that we could be disturbing 100 years of growth. So when they're mature, they have power. If you see a patch of trout lilies and there's only one leaf, that's not going to flower. Where you see the one leaf, you're not going to get a flower. You're only going to get a flower where you see two leaves together. And so these have to be about 7 years old before they even bloom. And the interesting thing about this plant is that during the winter, it'll send a little thread down into the ground towards the warmth, and it'll send all the energy in the bulb down to the end of that little thread. So by the time this plant might be old enough to bloom in its 7th year, that bulb will be 3 feet down in the ground. So if you try to dig one of these up out of the woods and it's a blooming plant, the likelihood that you're going to kill it is pretty good. So you want to dig, if you're going to go into a woodlot and maybe dig some of these, you want to make sure you do the ones that only have one leaf. And you'll notice at the bottom of the screen that I have this marked down as something that's black walnut tolerant. And I thought this was a good time to talk about also plants that you can grow under a walnut tree. Maybe that's all you have in your yard is a walnut tree. Well, there are some of these plants that will do much better than others under that walnut. And for those of you who don't realize, black walnut creates a thing called juglones, and it will inhibit the growth of other plants. And so some plants can deal with the juglones and some things can't. And this is one of the ones that can deal with it. So if you see a colony like this, just remember that this is probably 100 years old. And it's just amazing that these plants have persisted. And when you get a large number of these plants blooming, you know it's a very old colony. Dutchman's breeches and squirrel corn, two really interesting plants that are dicentrous. So they are in the bleeding heart family. And you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, that is the squirrel corn. And in the bottom below that is Dutchman's breeches. And then next to the Dutchman's breeches, you can see the roots and the little corms of the Dutchman's breeches, while on the far left, that's the roots of the squirrel corn. And it was kind of named squirrel corn because people thought it resembled little kernels of corn, and the squirrels like to eat it. So there you go. That's how it got its name. But these bloom pretty early. The foliage on both of them is so similar that even I have trouble telling them apart. And I have to put the squirrel corn and the Dutchman's breeches together side by side to be able to tell which one is which. And generally, the squirrel corn is a little more finely dissected than the Dutchman's breeches. But when you see a colony of that, it's also beautiful. And this doesn't really seem to be one of those woodland flowers that has to be on a slope, although this picture is. You'll see them down in the bottom of your woodland too. Virginia bluebells, there's just nothing to not like about Virginia bluebells. They form a huge patch. So once you get them started, they can just be absolutely amazing when they're in bloom. The buds can be pink, as you can see in the photos, and then they turn blue. And if you're thinking about supporting pollinators, this is a beautiful plant to have in the landscape. It's early blooming, and those flowers support early flying bumblebees, which are one of your earliest pollinators that's out there and needs the support that you can give it. So grow bluebells for bumblebees. And then here are some ideas of some things that you can do. You can have a big path under a tree. And I love the picture with the path going through the bluebells. It just looks so natural, yet so beautiful. Spring beauties are one of my absolute favorites. For one thing, they'll really colonize and they're very dainty and delicate. But I also love the fact that their pollen is pink. How many plants do you know that have pink pollen? Not many. And I've got these great pictures of a spring beauty bee, and it's got itself all covered with that pink pollen from the spring beauties. The interesting thing about the spring beauty bee is that the spring beauty is the only thing that it collects pollen from, and it will nest on the ground near the patches of spring beauties. So anywhere where you've got spring beauties, you can be sure those little spring beauty bees are going to be nesting in the ground somewhere near there. They're active only when the spring beauty is blooming, and then they go back to sleep when the spring beauty stops. I think that's pretty cool. And when we think about how important our native plants are to pollinators, this is a fine example of a pollinator that evolved specifically for a certain plant. And as you can see, this is also black walnut tolerant. Another great thing about spring beauties is that they are edible, the entire plant. Not that I'm encouraging everybody to come and dig up big patches of spring beauties, but it's kind of cool to know that if you get hungry, you can cook the little tubers and eat them like potatoes, and you can eat the entire plant. Stems, flowers, leaves, the whole thing. Native Americans utilize this plant quite a bit in the spring. The next plant is also another edible one, which is mayapple. And mayapples just are pretty in the fact that you've got this wonderful kind of umbrella-shaped foliage, and then the apple is formed in between, kind of at the junction of where the two stems come up with the leaves. The one thing you want to make sure you do, though, if you're going to eat a spring beauty or a mayapple apple, make sure it's good and yellow, because if they're green, they're poisonous. And these are really, they have a great smell too. And it's a nice colonizer. So it looks great because it's a little taller than some of the other spring flowers. It looks really great with some of the shorter things. And here you can see some phlox, woodland phlox, along with the mayapple. And then there's some ferns interspersed in here. So it's always nice to think about when you've got these beautiful spring blooming plants going, you want to make sure that something's going to come up and fill in that spot later on in the season. Now, this is Perfoliate Bellwort, and also known as large flowered bellwort. It's really pretty. The flowers are interesting in that the petals are kind of curly, and the plant is, it's just kind of droopy, but it has a really nice look to it. And this is one that's really going to add some interest in your garden because it's kind of an unusual plant and you just don't see it everywhere. But it's also one that can handle that living under a black walnut. And here's a really nice big patch of that bellwort. Sessile trillium is another one that smells a little bit like rotting meat. Now, it's not so strong that you're going to walk past it and kind of gag, like you might with skunk cabbage, but it does. If you really sniff, you can smell just that slight tang of something rotten. This is a really nice short trillium, so it's really, really nice to have as a low ground cover or as something that's low in the front of your bed. And this one likes moist soil, so moist to medium. And so if you've got a spot that maybe stays a little too wet for some things, this trillium and also the bluebells will do nicely there. And the leaves are mottled and really pretty. So it does have a lot of visual interest. And you'll notice in this photograph that you can see the cutleaf toothwort that's kind of gone in and between all of the trillium. And we're going to look at that plant next. So this is cutleaf toothwort, another edible plant. How great is it that you can have these beautiful things in your garden, if they start getting out of hand, you can just eat them. So I kind of like that idea. The flowers are really fragrant on the toothwort, and it used to be a folk remedy for toothaches. It's kind of like horseradish. I've eaten it, and the leaves are edible. It's just kind of tasty. If you've ever eaten a nasturtium, I think it tastes a lot like nasturtiums as well. I'm one of those people that eats the flowers. So beautiful patch of Cutleaf Toothwort. This is one that's real common in Ohio woodlands. So it's one that you're going to find a lot of if you go for a walk in the woods. Bloodroot, another absolutely wonderful spring ephemeral. Now, Native Americans used to dig the roots of this and use them for war paint. So it's kind of interesting that, it gets its name because the sap in the root has kind of an orangey to red color. Doesn't get real tall, and oftentimes it's going to be even shorter, 12 inches. Early to mid-spring, got a beautiful white flower. The flower doesn't last too long, but the colony of plants will have blooms for about 2 weeks. And it is black walnut tolerant. And here's a couple of nice pictures of places where you might see that bloodroot. Sometimes people will tuck it in along the base of a tree, and it's just short enough that it's really eye-catching. And it makes a nice little patch once that colony gets established. Jefferson twin leaf has a flower very similar to your bloodroot, but it also has a much different leaf structure. And of course, it's named for Thomas Jefferson. So that's kind of interesting in and of itself. But it'll form some nice little patches. It's easy to grow, but it's kind of slow to get going. And it might take 5 to 8 years for it to bloom from seed. So you'll notice that's the situation with a lot of these spring ephemerals. Just, it's a reminder to not disturb them in the woods if you can help it. And if you're lucky enough to be able to find them for sale in the trade, do that rather than dig them out of a woodlot. And here's a nice little patch of Jefferson twin leaf. I think that the leaves to me kind of make me think of angel wings. Trillium grandiflorum. This is an absolutely phenomenal plant. When you get just the right place for it, you can get some really big colonies. The blooming period will last about 3 weeks, and the petals actually change color. So they go from white to pink once the flower is getting close to being done. And the next picture will really show that. This is an absolute beautiful flower, and for a trillium, it takes the cake. It's just the best. And here's a patch of that trillium, and you can see the pink older flowers with the white younger flowers, and it's just stunning. You get a big patch of that. It takes a while because these guys also can take up to 8 years to bloom once you start from seed. And one of the interesting things with a trillium is you may see young trillium near the patch that you won't even recognize as a trillium, because when you think trillium, it's the tri, so 3, 3, and 3. You get 3 sepals, 3 petals, and 3 leaves. But the young trilliums don't bloom, and they only have 1 leaf. So you won't recognize it as a trillium when it's probably 3 years of age or less. Dwarf larkspur. This is another one that when you see a big patch of it, which I'll show you in the next slide, it's mind-blowing. It's so pretty. The color is fantastic. It's a beautiful flower. You've got to have the right spot for it. But boy, if you've got a good spot where this plant is happy, it is really, really going to blow you away. And it's got a long bloom period for a spring ephemeral, which is about 3 weeks. Look at that. Isn't that just spectacular? I mean, the color is just amazing, and it's just so pretty. Such a beautiful, rich color. Jack in the pulpit. This is one that probably everybody is familiar with. And you'll notice in this, in the photograph in this one, you've also got Cutleaf Toothwort. So that Cutleaf Toothwort sort of shows up in a lot of places, and this is just the right area for it. The jacks are really interesting. You've got your little pulpit, and they won't get a pulpit on them until they're older too. So this is another one that when it's a young plant, you may only see the 3 leaves. And then as the plant gets older, then it will bloom. And then once it blooms, you'll find it in the woodland as the big red seed head. So that's what you're going to find in the fall. So even if you've forgotten where that jack in the pulpit was, if it was big enough to bloom, you're going to end up with those seeds. And this is a plant that's extremely easy to grow from seed. So it's one of those that you can collect the seed and you kind of clean the flesh off of it, and then you put it through a warm, moist stratification process, and then cold, moist. And sometimes it will start germinating even when it's still in the cold. Woodland Phlox, one of my absolute favorites as far as the spring ephemerals. And this is one where the foliage may persist into the summer. The blooming period is long, so it's about a month. And it has the most amazing sweet fragrance. So for me, this is one that I want to put around a bench where I can go out and sit in my little woodland garden and just smell the phlox. As a matter of fact, I have some blooming early in my greenhouse right now. And every time I go out to the greenhouse, I have to go stick my face in the phlox. It just smells amazing. And a big patch of that also is just absolutely spectacular. It's so pretty scattered in along with other plants. And you can see with it in this image, the comparison with the Mayapple, that the Mayapple is taller. And it's nice to have those height differences. You don't want everything to be the same height anyway. Now, this image, the picture shows foam flower, which technically is not a spring ephemeral, but I couldn't at least not mention foam flower. Foam flower makes a great ground cover. And when it blooms, as you can see, it's gorgeous. But it's technically not a spring ephemeral because the foliage is going to last through the summer. So I really didn't include it in this slideshow, except that I had to throw this picture in because it's just so pretty. And it's nice to think about when you're planning on doing a spring ephemeral garden, think about other plants like this foam flower that you can intersperse with them so that you've got something going on when the spring ephemerals are done. And here's another photograph that shows the woodland phlox with the foam flower and also with a cultivar of alum root or Cutera, coral bells, if you will. So there are so many different things that you can do with your woodland garden, and spring ephemerals are great for that really beautiful early color, but don't forget that there are a lot of really wonderful foliage plants that you can put in there with it to give more interest throughout the season. And if you're going to do a woodland garden, then you want to think about how you want it to look. So if you're looking to mimic a real woodland, you need a thick layer of leaf mold, you need a light, moist, acidic growing environment. And just with a little thought, you can create those conditions. So with woodlands, you're thinking about a shady spot. If you've got a backyard where you've got trees and it's kind of shady and you're always going, I don't know what I can put back here. These wildflowers are perfect. And in this image, you can see that there's trillium, and there's also a water leaf, which is down in the lower left corner. And then you've got the spring larkspur, and you've got some violets in there. I mean, it's very pretty. So you don't have to just think one species, mix it up a little bit. Find different things that grow well together, and you'll have a really colorful garden. Woodland flowers can be hard to find, and I'm really not promoting people going out to their woodlands and digging these things up. As I said, some of these colonies that you'll find in these woodlots are hundreds of years old, and I don't think it's a good idea to go out and just destroy that so you can add a couple of plants to your garden. And sometimes if you don't do it right, then you're killing that whole colony. So you want to be very thoughtful about what you move and how you move it. but you can create some beautiful gardens and go with a reputable dealer. I'm not saying you have to buy from Natives in Harmony for sure, but just go with somebody. If you're going to buy these plants, make sure you know what the provenance of those plants is. Know where they came from, know if they're local genetics, know that you're getting what you think you're getting. And then use what you see in the world around you in nature to create your garden. Think about what you see, just like with this photo of how you see the woodland phlox in there, and then you've got the trillium, and there's a little bed straw to the front, and even some ferns that are starting to come on. It's a very beautiful picture, and just having the tree trunk that's covered with the moss, that really adds to it. So you can think about when you're planting a garden, what do you like to see? What makes you happy? And then try to mimic that in your own garden. So if you're going to go for a woodland garden, in my opinion, you want to go for what the forest around you looks like. Go for the plants that you see in that forest, the things that seem to thrive in the kind of soil that you have. And once you have it going, if you've got trees around, then the trees are going to be your mulch. You don't really have to do a whole lot. You just leave the leaves there. And you do native plants that are adapted to those conditions. I don't ever advocate somebody trying to change the soil to fit the plant you want to put in there. Think about what your soil is like and pick the right plants, because you're going to be a lot happier with your garden if you pick the right plants in the first place, not if you're working constantly to try to keep the soil what the plant needs. And just remember too, that if you're letting the leaves drop and they're going to be the mulch in your garden, a good gust of wind may spread your mulch everywhere. Take your clues from nature. Look at those wooded areas near you. Consider what native plants you see. Maybe take a walk this spring and look at the woodlots around you. Go to your favorite park, see what's blooming there, and take note of what makes you happy and what you feel would work in your yard. You want to make sure you know what the light needs are for the plant, what the soil is like, what the drainage is. You know, some plants really like a moist area, while some, like Hepatica, don't want to be in a damp spot. And you don't have to have a big graphing program to be able to plan your garden. Take a look at your yard and kind of figure out, okay, I've got a tree here, you know, here's where the canopy is, and then figure out where your bushes are, and maybe kind of do something like this and draw a plan on a piece of paper and figure out where you want to put what. Just give it a little thought and don't just start throwing things in the ground just because you've got a bare space. I think it's a good idea to lay out your flower bed. I myself love garden hoses, and I keep garden hoses that have holes in them just to use to lay out beds, because those garden hoses are so nice to do that outline with. And then you can also, once you lay that hose out, my husband loves to be able to mow around my beds. He doesn't like it when I have something that's hard for him to mow around, and that makes sense. He loves being on his mower. So when I lay out a new bed, I use that garden hose, and then I'll get the mower out and mow around the garden hose just to see how easy it is to do that and make sure that it's going to be something that's going to be simple. And you also want to clear the area that you've laid out. And if you're going to do anything like stepping stones or paths, do that before you start planting your plants. It's really important to get that sort of structure in your garden, and it'll make everything go so much better. Here are some ideas for paths. Some people think they want stepping stones, and stepping stones are certainly beautiful. And some folks just like to line a path with stones and then put mulch in between. And then some folks are just fine with just a plain old dirt path. It's all up to you and what you find personally appealing. And you can go with benches in your garden, things that are a little more formal, or just a plain plank bench. So in nature, you always want to remember that you have high to mid canopies, and then there's the understory, and then there's the ground cover. When you start to plant your garden, I suggest that you keep them in the containers until you figured out exactly where they're going to go, and set the containers around, and then kind of visualize. where they're going to be and if that's really where you want them to be. So at least if they're in the containers and you change your mind, you can pick them up and move them, and you can play with that design until you get to where you want it to be. And also be sure that you prune any dense foliage around your shrubs or under your trees to open that canopy up. Number one, so you get the light through that the plants need, but also so you can move through it and so that you can really enjoy it. And you know, things like this, and yet have kind of a park-like feeling, are so enjoyable. And you see how you've got the different layers, you've got light filtering in, and it just makes it a really beautiful place to be. If you want to do something that's more formal, that's very simple. No, you can do that. And also, I don't want you to think that just because you're going to go with natives, you have to give up everything that you love. Don't give up your daffodils. If you want to keep some daffodils, do that. Just make sure that you're including something that's going to be very pollinator friendly, because in my mind, that's one of the biggest reasons to put natives in, because we want to help the pollinators. We also want to keep the landscape open for plants that may be struggling and may be losing their habitat. So I think it's a good idea to keep that in mind too. But just remember that there's nothing wrong with keeping some of those plants that you love, that you've grown up with. Maybe I have heirloom daffodils that have been passed down through the family, so I don't want to lose those, but I also want to be more native friendly. And then make sure when you start your garden that you take out anything that's going to become a problem weed. There have been so many times when I have put in a garden, I hate to admit it, and I didn't do a good job at eradication. And then you have things like bindweed pop up, and you thought you dug it all out, and there it is. And then once your plants are established, it's really hard to get that bindweed out of the center. And so then it seems like you're fighting with it all the time. So do your best to eliminate things that could become a problem before you put your new plants in. I think compost is a good idea if you really feel like you need more organic material in the soil. And then also, I think it's a good idea to really look at that spot and decide if it's going to be shady enough, and add those small trees and shrubs first. Don't wait until you've already got your spring ephemerals in there to decide to put a tree in, because if those ephemerals are asleep when you go to put the tree in, you're going to have a hard time finding things and making sure that you get them dug up. And also mix those ephemerals with plants that will fill in, so that when the ephemeral is going to sleep, something else like a fern or whatever is coming in and filling in that space. Some of the small ephemeral species like hepaticas and trout lilies and the spring beauties, those things should be put more towards the front of your garden, because you don't want them to be lost among larger perennials. And if you've got rocks and or rocky crevices or little places where those things might fit in, they also look really nice against that backdrop. And then if you have a pathway that's not used a lot, they're also pretty there. Mayapples and bloodroot and bluebells and ramps and jack in the pulpit are all things that will form a nice colony. And so if you get them started, they can eventually make a nice ground cover. Triums and wild hyacinth and shooting star are really pretty when they're in masses, and plant them near masses of plants so that you've got a later season interest too. So if you're going to do some woodland aster, like whitewood aster, you might want to have that near where your triums and wild hyacinth are, so that it's going to take over and still give you some visual interest once those things go to sleep. And then you might even think about a bird bath or a bench or something else. And I love this picture of the fawn drinking out of the bird bath, so I just had to throw that in there. You never know what's going to come visit your bird bath. Maybe it won't even be birds, but it'll still be interesting. And if you need to use mulch, don't be afraid to, but try to make sure that that mulch is one that matches your natural woodland, something that looks very natural. Please don't use those colored mulches. Do something like pine needles or shredded leaves or even bark. And then let your spreading ephemerals fill in under larger trees and shrubs where they can stay green and attractive for as long as possible. because a lot of those, as long as it's shady, they'll stay much prettier. And finally, for the last slide, I've got a bunch of plants that will go just fine under black walnuts. And not all of these are spring ephemerals, but these are all plants that if you've got a black walnut tree that's causing you problems and you don't know what to put under it, these are plants that will do wonderfully under that black walnut tree. And I thank you very much. This has been fun, and I hope we've got some questions out there. I'll try to help.
Yes, thank you. That was great. And yeah, questions have been pouring in. So I am going to read the questions that started at the top. Somebody asks if you'll be delivering to the Whetstone parking lot, apparently as you have done in the past.
Well, let's see. We are going to do an online sale for the Worthington Garden Club, I believe, this year. And we also are going to be doing the plant sale for wild ones.
Okay.
So that's going to happen, I think, about the next to the last Saturday in May. But yeah, and by the way, though, those spring ephemerals, by that time, are going to be long gone. They'll be done by the end of May. So if anybody wants spring ephemerals, they're going to need to try to get them a little earlier, or they'll be planting a root.
Okay, and actually, could you tell everybody a little bit about what you do? What is Native Harmony?
Oh, Natives in Harmony is a native plant nursery. I started the nursery about, oh my gosh, 12 years ago now. It's hard to believe that it's been going that long, but I started it to donate plants. I didn't ever intend to sell. I was just growing plants and donating them to park districts. And the next thing I knew, people were contacting me and saying they had seen my plants at Crawford County Parks, for instance, and they'd been looking for something like Rattlesnake Master for years and years, and they couldn't find it. And then all of a sudden it showed up in this planting at the park, and they told them they got it from me. So I started being asked to supply plants to the general public, and I thought, okay, I can do that. So here I am.
That is
And
excellent. And I think I saw on your
small-
website, sorry, I think I saw on your website, are you operating your store by appointment at the moment?
This time of year, we're really not selling. It's just too early, but we open up April 18th, and that's when the spring ephemerals will start going on sale. So people can call and reserve plants to pick up on the 18th, but we probably, unless you make an appointment, we will not have visitation before the 18th. And then starting the 18th, we're going to be open on Sunday, Monday, and Saturdays. Saturday is a new day this year. In the past, it's only been on Sundays and Mondays.
Okay, thank you. Somebody asks, how have nurseries been affected, or have they been affected by the supply chain interruptions?
Oh, wow. Because we grow our own seed, and for the most part, our plants all come from seed that we collected here. That part of the supply hasn't been affected. But last year, for instance, we had a horrible time getting plant labels for pot stakes. You couldn't find them. The factories were shut down because of COVID, and you couldn't get pot stakes. We also went through a period where we couldn't get pots. We went through a period where we couldn't get the inserts for the trays to put the pots in. So it affected us in that way. And it was kind of interesting because here we are. Lots of people are home and they're gardening at home because of the virus. And so they're working in their own yards, and they want to come to the nursery and do a, drive in, pick it up and run kind of thing. And we can't even get pots to put the plants in. So in a way, it was a good thing for me that I've been recycling pots for people, because I didn't have to rely on that supply chain. I was using used pots and putting plants in the used pots, but it has affected us some.
Wow. All right. And somebody else asks, could you define ephemeral?
Well, an ephemeral is a plant that's only there for a short time, maybe 2 months. So it starts real early in the spring. It'll just kind of pop up out of the ground as soon as the ground starts to warm. And then before summer comes, it's gone. So that's kind of, think a daffodil. If you think of a plant that most everybody's familiar with, a daffodil is kind of an ephemeral.
All right, thank you. Somebody else asks, do you sell seeds at your store?
Not as a general rule, because we only collect the seed that we need to plant what we need to plant for our own supply. Now, the last couple of years, we've been collecting more than normal because we're making it available to the Delaware Parks and Preservation for plantings that they have going on in Delaware County because they want local genetics. So we do occasionally, if we have a little bit of extra, I may make some seed packets and sell them, but as a general rule, no. I do let people come to the nursery and collect. So we make our seed available once we've collected everything we're going to collect. If people want to come and collect seeds to do a planting of their own, we let them come.
That's amazing. Okay, and could you give a brief explanation of stratification?
Okay, sure. Yeah, stratification is when you have to put the seed through something that mimics the seasons. So we do cold moist stratification for most plants, and that means that you mix the seed with a little damp potting soil or some kind of damp medium, and I throw it in the refrigerator for however long it needs. For some species, it only needs 10 days, and some species have to have 120 days. So it takes a little research so you know which ones have to have longer. And a lot of the woodland plants are different in that they need to have warm, moist stratification and then cold, moist. So that means you have to mix the seed with potting soil. And I like to set it on top of my refrigerator to mimic the warm, moist. So I put it in a baggie, mix the seed with the dirt, put it in a baggie on top of my refrigerator because that's kind of an even temperature. And then for usually it's 60 to 90 days, warm, moist. And then you take it off the top of the refrigerator and shove it in the fridge to mimic winter. And that's usually another 60 to 90 days. And that means a lot of record keeping, and you have to make sure that you mark on the outside of the bag, when it goes into cold and when it's supposed to come out of cold. And then you sew it in a flat and pray.
I can just see visitors to your house and you're like, yeah, go into the fridge. And they're like, what is this?
Yeah, right now there is a cardboard box sitting on top of my refrigerator that's full of bags of dirt and seed. It's normal.
Fantastic. All right. Somebody says, can spring ephemerals be planted in turf or grass or a lawn, or do you need a wooded area?
You don't want to put them in full sun because the whole fact that they're a spring ephemeral, they're generally a woodland plant. The ones that can do the best in the turf would be things like spring beauties, because you'll see them naturalize out into your yard. So a spring beauty is one that could handle something like that. And if you've got an edge along a woodland, then you could do that with Virginia bluebells, because they're going to go dormant by the time you're mowing your lawn and the roots are down in the ground, so you're not going to really bother them. But for the most part, I would stay away from doing that. You don't want to put them out in too much sun.
Thank you. All right. Can you explain local genetics when it comes to buying local versus buying out of the area?
Oh, yeah. Well, at least to my understanding, we feel that when you're doing local genetics, you're doing plants that evolved in the area with the same climate conditions. Granted, we've got changes happening with climate now, but still, those are more of a gradual thing, and we're still better off buying plants or putting plants in our landscape that are locally sourced. So when you think about, and I'll just make an example, there's a really big nursery up in Wisconsin. And if you go to that nursery in Wisconsin and you buy plants, and then you're bringing them down here, the soil is very much different in Wisconsin than the soil is here. The plants are adapted to bloom at the time, over thousands of years, I might add, at the time when the pollinators in Wisconsin need them. But if you bring them to Ohio, they're not going to bloom at the same time as a plant, that's evolved here in Ohio. And I'll just give one example. And while it's not a spring ephemeral, for me, it speaks volumes. I grow 2 Liatris spicatas. That's dense blazing star. From 2 different places. One dense blazing star comes from up around Lake Erie, near the Lakeside Daisy Preserve. The other dense blazing stars that I'm growing, the genetic source is Central Ohio. So they're from Marion County. Now, you wouldn't think, it's a couple of hours away, so you wouldn't think there'd be that much difference. But the Liatris spicata from the Lakeside Daisy Preserve area blooms 10 days later than the Liatris spicata from Marion County. So just thinking you've got a 2-hour drive to get to where one is from. And if you're out here in my gardens, you're going to see the Marion County spicata blooming for 10 days before you ever see the Lake Erie spicata starting to bloom. So when you think about the pollinators and the pollinators needing a certain thing to be blooming so that it can feed them, that is a big difference, a 10-day lag in when something is blooming. And if you can see that big of a difference in just one species, even though I'm not a scientist, it makes me wonder how much of a difference would we have in regular bloom times between a plant from Central Ohio and a plant from Wisconsin.
Wow. All right. Somebody has a question. So can like a house shadow mimic trees enough to be able to do it outside of tree cover?
Well, I think that depends on the house and on the soil around the house. Because a lot of times when you build a house, the soil is so badly damaged and compacted that you may not have that good humusy soil that you would need for a lot of these plants. There are some that will do quite well in the shadow of a house. I have some spring ephemerals planted on the north side of my house, and they're doing okay. But I think it would more depend on the plant itself and how much moisture is in the soil, and then which side of the house is it facing. Like if you want to plant something on the west side of your house, yes, it's in the shade in the morning, but in the late afternoon, it's going to be baked hard and hot, and that's not going to be something that your spring ephemerals are going to be very happy with.
Thank you. Somebody asks if you use a flame weeder, which I don't know, so I'm looking forward to the answer on this one.
A garden dragon, yes. We love burning the prairie with a garden dragon. There's something really satisfying about seeing those weeds go up in flames.
Okay. All right. Let me find. 1 second. Now I'm scrolling down the questions. I was writing them down, but people keep adding questions, which is great. All right. Somebody asks if you grow ephemerals from seed. So it sounds like you're collecting the seeds. So are you growing your own plants by seed?
Many of them I am. I do have a supplier who has requested that we not give her name out. She doesn't want to be bombarded. But I do have a woman who sends a lot of spring ephemerals my way on things that I'm not able to grow. We do quite a few, as many as we can from seed. And so right now we have things that I didn't even discuss, like March marigolds growing from seed. We have spring beauties that jumped the gun and they're blooming in the greenhouse right now. They should not be doing that, but they are. So yeah, we do collect seed as much as we can. Sometimes I totally miss the seed because I get busy and it slips past me and it's gone by the time I go out there and look. And so there are years where I may have had something last year and I don't have it this year because I didn't get seed collected and I didn't get any to grow. But as much as we can, we grow our own from seed. And
how
we
old do they tend to be?
I'm sorry?
Sorry, how old do they tend to be before you'll sell them as plants?
It depends on which species it is. If it's a trillium, I try not to sell them before they're 3 years old because most people just don't recognize them when they're only one leaf. They don't look like a trillium. And people think I'm trying to pull a fast one on them because it doesn't look like a trillium. there's just some plants like that that you can't, and then some things like Virginia bluebells, if you can sell them the first year. And that's when that's nice, because when they're first year plants, I can get them in a plug pot. And that means you can get them cheaper than you could if I held on to them until they were so big they had to fit in a gallon pot.
All right. And somebody asks what your spring hours currently are.
Well, we open April 18th, and we're open from noon to 6. April 18th is a Sunday. And then from that point on, we're open Sundays, Mondays, and Saturdays this year from noon to 6.
Okay. And could you tell everybody your website address, while we're here?
www.nativesinharmony.com.
Easy enough. And that's a good way to check the hours.
Yeah, you can Google Natives in Harmony and we pop right up.
Yeah. And somebody asks what your favorite companion plants are that you use to fill the space when ephemerals go dormant, but they don't overrun them.
Okay, boy, I wish I'd left my presentation as long as I had it originally, because I had lots of my favorites. I love foam flower. I included the picture in the presentation. Foam flower is gorgeous, and the foliage stays nice. It's just a wonderful plant. I also love wild geraniums. They're also a really nice plant to put in there. And wild ginger, while you think of it, a lot of people think of it as a spring ephemeral, it's really not, because the foliage stays there all year long. And wild ginger can really colonize an area, and those glossy leaves are just gorgeous. I also am a huge fan of the skullcaps, and hoary skullcap in a woodland garden is absolutely beautiful. It's taller, so it can kind of hide some of those shorter things. When you get it going, it's a little slow to get started in the spring, but then when it takes off, it can be 2.5 feet tall, and then it gets beautiful bright blue flowers on it. So there are just an awful lot of things that you can mix in with those spring ephemerals.
Do you need to be concerned about specific tree canopy or mycorrhizae fungi for certain species?
Oh my gosh. That's one thing I am not. I think you do need to consider mycorrhizae. I don't know. I'm not a soil scientist, and boy, I wish I knew a lot more about the interactions with mycorrhizae. I think there's so much more to learn. I have not, I will say, and I'm almost ashamed to say it, I have not paid a lot of attention to that in many of my plantings. And that doesn't mean that I don't think it's important. It's just that has not really been my focus. And the more I learn about the importance of mycorrhizae, the more I wish I knew more about it. We do, when we transplant things, we do use an organic transplant fertilizer that has mycorrhizae in it to try to enhance the nutrient uptake of the plants that we're transplanting. The only problem with that is when you're using a product like that, it's kind of a crapshoot, to be honest, because you don't really know which mycorrhizae it is that plant might need, and you don't really know what it is that they included in that transplant fertilizer. So you don't really know if you're making a good match when you're using that. But we have noticed that the plants have done much better when we transplant them into pots using this organic transplant fertilizer with the mycorrhizae. So yeah, I would love to be a better soil scientist so I have more understanding of mycorrhizae and the nutrient uptake, because I think it is important.
Thank you. Somebody asks for, let's see, are there cultivars of spring ephemerals? And if so, is this a good idea?
Oh, okay. I'm going to try to be nice about this. Yes, there are cultivars, but no, I don't think it's a good idea. And the reason being is that a lot of those cultivars, what you end up with is a double flower, for instance. So there are bloodroot that they have developed a double flower on. The problem is that when you develop a double flower, you're giving up the pollen, because you're kind of taking that and trading it out for that double flower. So a lot of plants that have that kind of a flower have been tweaked like that, don't produce the pollen and the nectar that they used to before they played with them. And I personally think it's a good idea to stay away from those. Or if you're at least going to use them, try to use some of the straight species too, because there's a lot of research that's been done that shows that many times when you've messed with the flower on a plant, you have really taken its value to the wildlife that need it down.
Okay, thank you. And somebody does ask, what is the Latin name for foam flower?
Tiarelia cordifolia.
Quarter.
And I probably just butchered the Latin, so don't use my pronunciation.
All right, I'm writing this in the first word is in there, and now there, cordifolia. So it's in now in the chat. So again, everybody will get
off the top of my head for foam flower.
That is mighty impressive, though. Good job.
I try.
All right. Well, it is about 7:58. Gale, thank you. This was wonderful, and it was nice to get a little early visual of spring in these early days of March.
It's a good feeling. I'll tell you what, there's nothing more gratifying than walking out into that greenhouse. I have twin leaf blooming and woodland phlox, although ideally I don't want them to bloom this early because that means they won't be blooming when you see them. But for me, it's really nice.
Right. Excellent. All right. Well, Gale, thank you very much. Excellent job. Everybody, thank you for attending. And Gale, you ought to open up the chats if you don't have it open, so as people are giving you some props right now.
All right. Thank you. I've got it open.
All right, Gale, thank you again. And you have a good evening. Everyone, good night.
All right.